My name is Marina Calloway. I'm 31 years old. And the Saturday morning I found out my childhood home had been listed for sale, without a single word to me, was the morning I finally understood that being dependable is not the same thing as being valued. It was my neighbor, Dottie Frazier, who told me. She called at 8:42 in the morning, and I remember the exact time because I was already in the car, already on my way to my father's house to handle his weekly medication sort. Dottie said she'd been walking her dog past the property and noticed the sign. A white post, a lockbox on the front door, a laminated flyer tucked into a plastic sleeve. She said she assumed I knew. I didn't. I sat in the driveway of my own apartment for 4 minutes before I pulled back out onto the road. I did not turn around and go inside. I did not call my sister. I drove to my father's house, let myself in with my key, made him breakfast, sorted his prescriptions into the weekly tray the way I had done every Saturday for 2 years and 11 months, and I listened to him talk about a woodpecker that had been bothering the oak tree out back. He did not mention the sign. I don't think anyone had told him either. What none of them knew, what my mother and my sister had never once thought to verify, was that my father had added my name to the deed on that property 6 years earlier. Quietly, during a period when his health had first started to slip and he'd wanted, as he put it, to make sure someone sensible was attached to the house. That document was on file at the county recorder's office. It had been there for 6 years, and not one person in my family had looked. I should tell you something about that house before I tell you what happened next, because the house matters in a way that goes beyond square footage or assessed value or any number a realtor puts on a flyer. My father, Gerald Calloway, bought that property in 1989, the year before I was born. It's a craftsman-style bungalow on a corner lot in a neighborhood that used to be quiet and has since become desirable in the way that older neighborhoods go, slowly, then all at once. Original hardwood floors, a front porch with a swing my father built himself, a kitchen that has been updated exactly once in 35 years. 3 bedrooms. A detached garage that my father converted into a workshop and never unconverted. We grew up in that house, my sister Claudia and I. Claudia is 4 years older than me and has lived 40 minutes away since she married her husband, Derek, in 2016. I am the one who stayed close. I'm the one who took the apartment 12 minutes from my parents' house, not because I couldn't afford to live elsewhere, but because proximity felt like the right choice when my father's cardiologist first used the phrase ongoing management in 2020. My mother, Patricia, retired from her position as an office administrator the following year. She and Claudia have always had an ease with each other that I recognize without being wounded by, most of the time. They share a cadence. They finish each other's thoughts in a way that sometimes makes me feel like I wandered into a conversation that started before I arrived. I am not the daughter my mother expected. I am quieter than she wanted, more interested in paperwork and process than in the social architecture that she and Claudia find natural. I work as a paralegal at a mid-sized civil litigation firm, which means I spend my days reading documents that other people don't want to read, catching the details that other people miss. It is not glamorous work. It has been, it turns out, exactly the right training. When my father's health began declining in a more consistent way in early 2021, more appointments, a medication adjustment that needed monitoring, a fall in the workshop that scared all of us, I was the one who restructured my schedule. I moved my working hours earlier in the morning, so I could be at his house by the early afternoon on the days his physical therapist came. I became the one who talked to his cardiologist, Dr. Emmett Horace, and his primary physician, Dr. Sandra Tully, who between them were managing a cardiovascular situation that required more coordination than my mother could comfortably handle on her own. I set up a shared document where I tracked his appointments, his medications, his insurance correspondence. I added my mother and Claudia as editors. Neither of them used it. That is not a complaint. That is context. My father was not incapacitated. He was diminished in specific ways and fully present in others. He still drove to his Tuesday morning coffee group. He still had opinions about the woodpecker. But he tired easily and he found certain kinds of administrative pressure difficult. Insurance disputes, contractor negotiations, anything that required sustained follow-up. Those things became mine. It was during one of those administrative stretches in the spring of 2018, before any of the serious health events, that my father had called me into his workshop and shown me a document. He'd had it prepared by his attorney, a man named Wallace Okafor, who had been handling my parents' affairs for over a decade. The document was a deed amendment adding my name as a co-owner of the property. My father explained it plainly. He said he'd been thinking about what happens when he's not around to manage things, and he wanted someone on the deed who would read the paperwork. He said this without sentiment. He said it the way he said most things, practically and with precision. I asked if my mother knew. He said she did, and that she had agreed it made sense. I asked if Claudia knew. He paused. He said it hadn't come up. I signed where Wallace Okafor indicated. I kept a copy in a file folder at my apartment labeled with my father's name and the year. I did not bring it up at family dinners. It did not seem like the kind of thing that required announcing. That was 6 years before the sign appeared in the yard. In those 6 years, I watched my father's workshop fill with half-finished projects and my mother's patience with the house begin to thin. Patricia Calloway had not wanted to stay in that neighborhood as it changed. She wanted something smaller, something with a homeowners association that handled the landscaping, something closer to Claudia and the grandchildren. I knew this. I heard it at Thanksgiving and at Easter, and at the occasional Sunday dinner, where the conversation turned, as it reliably did, to what came next. I was not opposed to a sale. I want to be precise about this, because the story I am telling is not about me being attached to a building. It is about being treated as though I didn't exist. Claudia had her own reasons for wanting the sale resolved. She and Derek had taken on a significant renovation loan on their own home in 2022, and the market had moved in a direction that put them in a tighter position than they'd anticipated. I knew this in the abstract. I did not know, until much later, that she had been specifically calculating her share of the proceeds from my father's house as part of a plan to refinance. That calculation had been going on for months before the sign went up. What I pieced together afterward, from a combination of things my father told me and a conversation I had with Wallace Okafor's office, was this. Sometime in the late fall of the previous year, my mother and Claudia had begun meeting with a realtor named Garrett Wynn, who worked out of an office on the east side of town. Garrett Wynn had assessed the property at somewhere between $389,000 and $415,000, depending on final condition, and had advised a spring listing for maximum exposure. My mother and Claudia had proceeded through that entire process, the consultation, the assessment, the staging walkthrough, the listing agreement, without once mentioning any of it to my father's attorney, and without once mentioning it to me. My father, I believe, understood something was being discussed. He had not been told the specifics. He is not the kind of man who pushes when he senses people are managing him, and I think my mother and Claudia had learned to have those conversations when he was resting. I think about that more than I probably should. The listing went live on a Thursday evening. The offer came in on a Friday, a cash offer from a buyer who had apparently been watching the neighborhood and moved quickly. My mother accepted it. The accepted price was $397,500. Garrett Wynn submitted the paperwork to the title company that same afternoon. The sign went up on a Friday evening. Dottie Frazier called me on a Saturday morning. I want to tell you exactly what my mother said when I called her, because the words matter. I called her from my father's kitchen, after he had finished his breakfast, and moved to the front room with the newspaper. I stepped into the hallway and kept my voice level. I told her I'd heard about the listing. There was a pause. Then she said, "You've been so busy, Marina. We didn't want to bother you." I held the phone and looked at the wall calendar in my father's hallway, the one where I had written in his appointments in blue pen for the next 6 weeks. I counted 4 of my own handwritten entries, just in the visible portion. I said, "Okay." She asked if I wanted to come to Sunday dinner to talk about the plan. I said I would think about it. I did not tell her what I was thinking about. I finished my visit with my father, drove home, unlocked my apartment, and sat down at the desk where I keep my files. I pulled out the folder with my father's name on it and removed the deed amendment. I read it twice, though I knew what it said. Then I called Wallace Okafor's office and left a message asking for a call back at his earliest convenience. Wallace Okafor called me back that same afternoon. He was thorough and calm in the way that good estate attorneys tend to be. He confirmed that the deed amendment was valid and on record. He confirmed that as a co-owner, I would need to be a party to any sale. He confirmed that no title company could legally close the transaction without my signature or a court order resolving a dispute between co-owners. He used the word impediment twice. He did not use it with any drama. He used it the way you use a word when it is accurate. I thanked him. I made a note of the date and time of the call. I did not contact my mother or my sister that evening. Monday morning, the closing attorney's office, a firm called Hargrove and Stellan, ran the title search. Title searches for residential properties in our county are thorough. They go back decades. They catch amendments. The paralegal who ran the search found the deed amendment within the first 20 minutes. At 11:14 on a Monday morning, a woman named Priscilla Tate, a paralegal at Hargrove and Stellan, called my mother to inform her that there was a complication with the title. She explained that the property had a co-owner of record whose consent would be required to proceed. My mother called me at 11:31. I let it ring. She called again at 11:40. I was on a call with my own attorney, a woman named Diane Foss, who specialized in property and estate disputes and who had agreed to take a brief consultation on the situation. Diane Foss was methodical. She walked me through my options. I could consent to the sale with conditions, I could withhold consent and require the listing be withdrawn, or I could consent to the sale contingent on a revised distribution that reflected my legal position. She was clear that my position was not ambiguous. She said the phrase clean title and explained what its absence meant for the timeline of the pending offer. The buyer's offer had a closing window. Cash offers typically do. The window on this one was 11 days from acceptance. Day 2 of that window was a Monday. I did not call my mother back until Tuesday morning. By Tuesday, she had called 7 more times. Claudia had called 4 times and sent 3 text messages, the tone of which shifted noticeably from the first to the last. My father had called once on Monday evening to ask if I was coming by on Wednesday. I called him back within the hour and confirmed I was. I did not discuss the house. I called my mother on Tuesday at 9 in the morning from my office before the workday properly began. I told her I was aware of the situation. I told her I had spoken with Wallace Okafor and with my own attorney. I told her I had a few questions before I made any decisions. The first question was when she and Claudia had begun working with a realtor. The silence before she answered ran long enough that I counted it. 6 seconds. She said they had started talking to Garrett Wynn in October. October was 4 months earlier. In October, I had driven my father to 3 cardiology appointments and handled a billing dispute with his supplemental insurance that had taken 11 phone calls to resolve. I asked if she had understood, when she signed the deed amendment in 2018, that it meant I would need to be included in any sale decision. She said she hadn't really thought of it that way. I said I understood. I told her I would need until Thursday to make a decision. She asked what kind of decision. I said a decision about whether I would sign. The chair in my mother's kitchen, I know the sound of it, I have heard it my whole life, scraped against the tile floor. I told her to have a good morning and ended the call. I want to be honest about what the following 48 hours were like for me, because I think people expect this part of the story to feel like power. It did not feel like power. It felt like sitting with something heavy and trying to figure out exactly where to set it down. I spent Tuesday evening reading through the listing agreement that Garrett Wynn had filed. I had requested a copy through the title company, which was entitled to share it with me as a party of interest in the transaction. I read the commission structure. I read the closing timeline. I read the addenda. I am a paralegal. Reading documents is what I do, and what I did that night was read everything available to me and understand exactly what had been built and what required my signature to complete. The offer on the table was $397,500 cash from a buyer named in the paperwork as a trust entity. Clean offer. No contingencies except the title. The commission to Garrett Wynn's office was structured at a standard percentage, which at $397,500 worked out to slightly under $24,000. The proceeds after commission and estimated closing costs would land somewhere around $369,000. My mother and Claudia had presumably understood this number as available to divide between them. I thought about Claudia's renovation loan. I thought about the fact that she had 4 years on me and had always moved through the family with more ease. I thought about the Sunday dinners I had missed because I was handling my father's insurance correspondence. I thought about the filing cabinet in my apartment where I keep every document I have ever been given in connection with my father's affairs. I did not think about revenge. I thought about clarity. On Wednesday, I went to my father's house at the regular time. I made lunch. I helped him with a letter he wanted to send to his veterans organization. He asked me at one point whether I knew what was going on with the house, because your mother seems worried about something. I told him there was a paperwork situation that I was sorting out. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "You always did read the paperwork." I left at 3 in the afternoon. On Thursday morning, I called Diane Foss. I told her my decision. I did not refuse the sale outright. I want to be precise about this, because the story is not about blocking something for the sake of the block. My decision was more specific than that. I told Diane Foss that I was willing to consent to the sale under 3 conditions. The first condition was that my share of the net proceeds reflect my legal ownership position as established in the deed amendment, a position that Diane had confirmed, based on the language of the document, represented a joint tenancy interest. The second condition was that my father be informed of the full situation, in plain language, by Wallace Okafor, before any documents were signed. The third condition was that the listing agreement be revised to include me as a party, so that any decisions about price adjustments, buyer negotiations, or closing accommodations required my written consent. These were not punitive conditions. They were the conditions that should have existed from the start. Diane Foss sent a formal letter to Hargrove and Stellan, with copies to Garrett Wynn's office and to my mother's address, on Thursday afternoon. The letter outlined my position, my conditions, and the legal basis for each. The buyer's closing window had 9 days remaining. The meeting happened on a Saturday, 11 days after the offer was accepted, 2 days before the closing window would expire. My mother had requested it. Claudia had driven up the evening before and stayed overnight. Wallace Okafor attended, at my request. Garrett Wynn was on a phone line because he could not rearrange his schedule. Diane Foss was available by phone, but I had told her I didn't think I would need her present. We sat in my parents' living room, my mother in her chair by the window, Claudia on the love seat with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, my father in his usual seat, which he had pulled slightly forward, the way he does when he intends to pay attention. I sat across from my mother on the small sofa I had sat on my entire life. Wallace Okafor had, as I requested, spoken with my father privately the evening before. My father had listened, asked 2 clarifying questions, and said very little beyond that. When he came into the living room that morning, he looked at my mother in a way that I recognized as a look between people who have been married for a long time and have reached the far side of an argument. Claudia began. She said that none of this had been intended to exclude me, that the timing had been difficult, that they had simply been trying to get things moving while I was so focused on Dad's care. I let her finish. I said, "I understand." Then I set the copy of Diane Foss's letter on the coffee table and said that my conditions were straightforward and that if everyone was in agreement, we could move forward with the sale in a way that worked for all of us. I said it without leaning forward. I said it the way I say most things that matter, in a register slightly quieter than the room. Garrett Wynn, on the phone, asked if we could discuss the timeline. I said we could. Claudia said that she didn't understand why a deed from 6 years ago was suddenly a problem. Wallace Okafor, without any visible change in his expression, said that the deed had not become a problem recently. He said it had been a fact of record since it was filed. He said that the complication was not the document. The complication was that the document had not been considered during the planning process. The mug in Claudia's hands went still. My mother looked at the window. My father looked at me. I did not say anything further. The conditions were in writing. They did not require me to elaborate. The meeting lasted 1 hour and 20 minutes. Most of that time was Wallace Okafor and Garrett when working through the mechanics of what a revised listing agreement would require and what the buyer's title company would need to proceed. The buyer had been notified of the title complication through standard channels and had, as cash buyers sometimes do, elected to wait rather than withdraw. The property was what they wanted, and the delay was within a range they could manage if the parties reached agreement. My conditions were accepted. All three of them. The revised listing agreement was prepared and sent for signatures the following week. It included my name. It specified the distribution structure. It required my written consent for any material changes to the transaction. My mother signed without comment. Claudia signed after asking Garrett Wynn twice whether there was any other approach and receiving the same answer twice. I signed last. The sale closed 22 days after the original window expired, with a brief extension negotiated through the buyer's council. The final sale price remained at $397,500. The net proceeds after commission and closing costs came to $371,240. The distribution, per the revised agreement and the terms Diane Foss had outlined, reflected my ownership position. Garrett Wynn's commission was $23,850. Wallace Okafor's fees for the additional work were billed to the estate and deducted before distribution. My father, Gerald Calloway, received his portion separately, per a structure that Wallace Okafor had recommended and that everyone agreed made sense given his ongoing care needs. The house was transferred to its new owners on a Tuesday in late spring. The buyer's representative did the final walkthrough on a Monday. I was not present for it. I had driven my father to a cardiology appointment that morning, and by the time I dropped him back home it was past 4 in the afternoon, and the light was the particular flat gold that late spring afternoons have in that part of the country. My father stood on the front step of the house he had moved into the year before I was born and looked at the workshop door for a long moment. Then he went inside. I want to tell you what happened in the months after, because the story doesn't end at the closing. Claudia and I did not speak directly for 6 weeks. The silence was not dramatic. We are both people who default to managing things internally, and 6 weeks of not calling each other is within the range of our normal pattern. When we did speak, it was brief and civil. She did not apologize. I did not ask her to. What she said, after some preliminary conversation about nothing in particular, was that she hadn't realized the deed was the way it was. I said, "I know." She said, "Wallace should have told us." I said, "He filed it at the county recorder's office." There was a pause. She said, "Right." My mother and I returned to our version of normal more quickly, which is to say we returned to the surface of things. She called me the following month to tell me she had found a condominium she liked, a 2-bedroom in a community 30 minutes from Claudia, with a homeowners association and a maintenance team, and a small patio that gets morning light. I helped her review the purchase documents. I caught an error in the HOA fee schedule that would have cost her an additional $180 annually. I flagged it for correction.
She thanked me.
She said, "I don't know what I'd do without you reading these things." I said, "I know." My father moved into an assisted living community 8 months after the house sale, a decision that had been coming for longer than any of us wanted to admit, and that his care team, including Dr. Emmett Horace and Dr. Sandra Tully and his physical therapist, a measured woman named Constance Webb, had been guiding us toward for most of the previous year. The facility is well regarded and 12 minutes from my apartment. I visit twice a week. He still has opinions about birds. I did not use my share of the proceeds to do anything dramatic. I paid off a small remaining balance on my own student loans, contributed to a fund I maintain for my father's supplemental care costs, and set aside the remainder in an account that I intend to be deliberate about. It is not a large sum in the way that large sums get talked about. It is the sum that results when you co-own a craftsman bungalow on a corner lot in a neighborhood that became desirable slowly, and then all at once. My work at the litigation firm continues. I was promoted to senior paralegal 8 months ago, a title that comes with a modest salary increase and a slightly larger desk. My supervising attorney, a methodical woman named Carla Denning, told me at my review that my attention to file documents was, in her words, the kind of thing that prevents disasters. I wrote it in my notes. I think about it sometimes. I am not telling you this story because I believe my mother and sister are bad people. I have spent enough time around enough people in enough difficult situations, through my work, through my father's medical process, through the years of managing things quietly, to know that most cruelty in families is not intentional. It is the byproduct of assumptions. People assume that the person who handles things will continue handling things. People assume that the person who is quiet will remain quiet. People assume that the documents they never read say what they expect them to say. The problem with assumptions is that they do not check the county recorder's office. What I have learned, through 6 years of being the one who reads the paperwork and 3 years of being the one who drives to the appointments and 48 hours of sitting with a decision that no one expected me to have, is this: showing up is not the same as being seen. And being seen is not something you can negotiate for after the fact. You can only build the conditions in which it is structurally unavoidable. The conditions were in writing. They had been for 6 years. What I want to leave you with is something simpler than a lesson, because I am not in the business of teaching. I am in the business of showing up and reading what is in front of me. What is in front of me now is a life that is mine. An apartment 12 minutes from my father. A filing cabinet that is organized and current. A job where my precision is valued. A family that is complicated and present, and now, finally, structurally unable to make major decisions without my signature. Not because I demanded that, because it was always true. We just all know it now. The document that protects you does not need to announce itself. It only needs to be on file. I want to ask you something before you go, because I think this story raises a question that deserves an honest answer. When Priscilla Tate, the paralegal at Hargrove and Stellan, made that phone call on a Monday morning, the call that unraveled 11 months of planning in under 4 minutes, my mother had a choice. She could have called me first. She had the information she needed to know the situation was complicated from the moment Garrett Wynn submitted the paperwork. She did not call me in October, or November, or December, or January, or in the 4 months of planning. She called me at 11:31 on a Monday because a title search had made it unavoidable. Here's my question for you. If you were in that room on Saturday, in that living room, on that sofa with Wallace Okafor's careful language settling over everything, at what point did you think the conversation actually changed? Was it when Claudia's mug went still? Was it when my mother looked at the window? Or was it the moment my father pulled his chair forward at the beginning, before anyone had said a word, because he already knew? Tell me in the comments. I read them. If this story stayed with you, please consider subscribing. New stories every week, always first person, always the long version for the people who want every detail. Take care of yourselves.